Kia ora, Mike.
Kia ora, Leanne. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you so much for giving us some time today to share some of your insights into your own journey of humanizing work.
Yeah, I'm very, very glad to share my experiences and I'm committed to making sure I do that in a way that actually helps other people.
Amazing. Thank you, Mike. Well, for those of you watching this video, let me just tell you a couple of things about Mike. So Mike was the founding chief executive of Z Energy here in New Zealand, and he was there for, was it 12 years, Mike?
13 years to the
13?
day, not that I'm counting.
Okay. That'd make it 13 years then. And while he was the chief executive at Z Energy in 2016, both he and Z Energy were the CEO and company of the year in the Deloitte Top 200. While Mike was the chief executive at Z Energy, he was also the founding convener of the Climate Leaders Coalition for 5 years. And nowadays, Mike last year put out a book which is one of my favorite books from this year, Being Extraordinary. This is a very practical, applied book that I've got to say, when I read Mike, resonated so deeply in terms of what I care about in terms of humanizing workplaces, hence inviting you in to get some wisdom from you on the screen today. So what Mike does is he is obviously an author, and he spends his time fulfilling on his purpose, which is realizing individual and organizational potential. And he does that through speaking, mentoring, consulting, coaching, and obviously writing. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
Righto, Mike. So the way that we always start these videos is just to get a little bit of a sense from you about what does human work mean to you?
I think it really is a situation where you create an environment within which people can experience belonging by being their authentic self.
Hmm.
Now, that can also be a way to describe what diversity, equity, and inclusion is like. But actually, I quite like it, for me anyway, as a really simple way to think about. So if a human workplace means it's a place where someone can belong by being themselves, that starts to open up a whole range of possibilities for me, because every person is unique. Every person is a person, not a unit of resource, and everybody brings something to the table and is capable of taking something away that enriches them in their outside of work lives.
Okay, thank you. So I'm hearing this really reciprocal relationship rather than more of this legacy idea of we get people to come to work to give us value. I'm hearing something that's more reciprocal than that.
Yes, it's something that's probably way deeper than the typical way of describing people as units of resource that you consume, yeah, albeit safely, while they're under your employment. I've been lucky enough to work in Asia, Africa, and Europe in my time, and so therefore a very broad set of cultures, and indeed some very, very old cultures like China, for example, or parts of Africa. And I think sometimes, if anything, there are cycles we go through. We certainly know there are economic cycles, there are commodity cycles. I actually think it's almost like there's a cycle around what we could broadly call workplaces, which in the good old days was about communities coming together, keeping the cave warm, going out and hunting and gathering. I think there is a great deal of wisdom to come from indigenous cultures that we can learn from, because those cultures have sustained for thousands of years, and a lot of the things that were very much part of the way they thought thousands of years ago, I think are very much like progressive thoughts from today's workplaces. Like,
Wonderful. This sounds like not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, Mike.
well, I think it's more a matter of what can we learn from the past, which may
Okay,
not
yeah.
always take exactly that thing and do it the same way, because the context is different. The gap that you're looking to close may be different. But I do think there's a lot of wisdom in these historic, long-lasting indigenous cultures that we can actually learn from, because they have survived for thousands of years, whether it be people in the Amazon jungle still doing things the same way today as they did many years ago, or indeed my experiences in Africa and Asia, where people clearly are living differently today to what they were thousands of years ago, but there are some principles that have come through their legacy or their history they are still applying in a very culturally appropriate way today.
I got it. And so, Mike, given that you and I are both situated in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we're having this conversation, I'm curious as to what is it that you've learnt from the Indigenous culture here, Māori leaders and ways of being and worldviews, that you think is a helpful way of being, thinking, making sense, that we can take into organisations to make them more human?
So just a couple of examples. So the whole notion of kaitiakitanga, so stewardship, that you are doing something today that is in service of those who come after you, your future ancestors, as well as honouring the past that you're from. And there's a beautiful expression where a guy called Owen Eastwood, who wrote a book called Belonging, speaks about whakapapa. And he says, when the sun is on your face, you are the link between your future and your past ancestors.
Oh.
But I think that, okay, so when the sun is on my face as the chief executive or as the leader in a particular organization, I think that's a beautiful way to think about, what's part of my role. It's to be the link between my past and my future ancestors. Now, that's not like that's an answer. I think that is a mindset that causes you certain sorts of questions for which you will ultimately have answers. So I think that it would be a very good example of a mindset that comes from Te Ao Māori that I think we could all benefit from.
Beautiful, Mike. Thank you so much. It's not very often, Mike, that in these conversations I'm engaging with folk actually here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'm really grateful for your ability to bring in that perspective in our conversation today. Mike, I'm curious as to whether or not you have a name for this type of leadership.
In some respects, I could call it extraordinary leadership because it's not that common. It's not always that predictable. I think there are plenty of other, whether you call them labels for it, there's other ways to describe these things. Human workplaces, for example, I think is a very common expression. And I think that at one level, I try not to use labels. Because sometimes when you use the label, people react to the label, usually from a position of not necessarily knowing what you are really meaning, or we often have words for which we have different meanings in workplaces in particular, like strategy, for example. So I tend, where a label is helpful or a definition that is commonly understood, I think it's great to use that. I tend to talk more where I can about principles or mindsets or practices, because, as I said, I think sometimes the label gets lost. I recently gave a presentation where at a conference, and part of the way I summarized my introduction was to say, look, none of what I'm about to say is true, but it's really useful.
Beautiful.
Just as a way to enable people to let go of this. Well, Mike say something that I agree with, therefore I'll listen, or actually I disagree with what he's saying, in which case I won't listen. Because whether it's true or not, there might be some usefulness in what I had to share. So that's, to me, is an example of practically not using a label, or if anything, taking the label away. It's not true, but it might be useful.
Got it. The reason why I ask that question about language, Mike, and I'm really hearing what you're saying in terms of its usefulness or otherwise, because it can really connect people into some baggage that they have around language. Either positive or negative, is that I personally find it challenging knowing how to talk about this, and I really want to talk about it. What would be my fondest aspiration in this lifetime would be that more and more of us talk about workplaces in ways that really set a new norm for the relationship between the employer and the human beings who are there, so that the human beings have the best chance possible to leave work at the end of the day feeling good about themselves to such a degree that they can go home to be the best parents and partners and contributing members of society they can be. So in my world, what you've just said sort of challenges something that I hold, which is trying to get closer to some agreed way of talking about this type of leadership, so that my logic, flawed as it may well be, is that if we've got some language, then maybe more of us can be talking about it and amplifying the message out into the world. And so one of the leaders in the book, I know you've read Human Work, Mike, Bob Chapman, the CEO from Barry Wehmiller in the US, he uses the term truly human leadership. And I quite like that, but it's quite interesting. It's got the word true in it, right? So it's like this is a conundrum. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I certainly have a great deal of empathy for what you just said. Labels or words for which there is a common definition is a great way to shorthand things. In business, we might call that jargon if you don't understand what it means, but jargon's a really effective way to communicate. What I do when I communicate, I tend to think more about what's in the mind of the other person. So you and I will talk, and I would very happily use the phrase human workplaces because we know what that means. I've read your book, you've read mine, so we know where we have commonality. If I was talking to some, dare I say it, some hard-assed alpha male who has a particular point of view on how to run organizations, that phrase may not be that helpful.
No.
So I talk more about maybe the benefits that come from human workplaces and how that relates to what may be most important to him, which is making money, to open up something that would otherwise be very difficult to open up. If I say, hey, my name's Mike and I want to talk to you about human workplaces, as opposed to, hey, my name's Mike, you want to make more money? Yep, here's some experiences that I had to share or some ways of doing it that would enable you to make more money than following your current formula, for example.
I so love what you're saying, Mike. It feels like this is about meeting people where they are. And it's all very well in the little bubble that I exist in, which is my LinkedIn community full of other people who really care about humanizing workplaces and, colleagues and clients and who are already like on this pathway of humanizing workplaces, which is a very, very different conversation than understandably so many leaders today who are not in a position for whatever reason to have been able to think about workplaces as being human. Workplaces are still the places to maximize profit in order to get the quarterly returns, in order to be able to satisfy shareholders. Like this legacy model is entirely understandable that we're in a place where many, many, many leaders are still thinking like that. So how do we get better at being, as you say, being able to meet people where they're at with what drives them?
Yes, I recently did some research for a keynote presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago, and I went back to some of the work from Daniel Goleman, the person who wrote the book around emotional intelligence, which eventually became EQ. He wrote that in 1996, and he had a follow-on book he published in 2001 called Primal Leadership. And I didn't read the whole book, but I read one of those fancy summaries of it. And there's a lot of things that he talks about in there that by understanding what human workplaces means today, where I go, actually, there's a whole lot of relevance from what he wrote in 2001 about the need for leaders to manage their emotions, about how they can directly impact the entire mood of the full organization. So I think we may call it human workplaces today, and I don't know whether it's the building blocks or the ingredients or the inputs have been explored by some of the world's leading business writers and thinkers for, let's say, decades.
That's right. This is not new.
Example, or Warren Berryman. Is it Berryman? Yeah, some of Bennetts rather. Warren Bennetts. So some of their stuff, with the wisdom or the filter of human workplaces, I can read it and go, well, actually, there's an old spin on a new concept. And as I said earlier, I think there's some wisdom that comes from Bennetts that actually can be brought into the modern version of human workplaces.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that in, Mike. Certainly when Narayan and I were writing Human Work, it really felt like we were standing on the shoulders of so many thinkers before us. And this is just another go at trying to, I hate to use the word popularize, but like impact in some way the mainstream dialogue about the relationship between the workplace and the humans. We're certainly so far away from being early on this. But that brings me to another question, which is about why don't we see more of it if we've been talking about it for a while?
Yeah, I think one way to approach that is what makes us slow learners. So if we come at it more positively, like,
Yeah.
what is it we're not learning versus we're wrong, bad, or terrible people by not doing it. Um, I just wonder whether there's not enough evidence for this. I
Hmm.
asked that as a question. Now, in my mind, there's plenty of evidence. I've got evidence for how I've lived my life or led the two companies I was responsible for 20 years. So I've got a ton of evidence that it works, if you like. I think there's a lot of other stuff, whether you read Harvard Business Review or Fortune magazine or any other leading business, either books or periodicals or columns. There's more and more of it being discussed. So I tend to come at it from the perspective, why are we slow learners? Is it that people of my generation were trained up a particular way at school and university and then post-grad, then decades of work experience where we looked up to these people who were masterful at their roles, as we thought at the time. And so we've been conditioned that way. Like one of the things I think I used to joke with people about is that you should have put me in charge of Z when I was 25 and knew everything compared to now, because I got, at the time I had more questions about my leadership and the most appropriate way to deal with things, in my 50s than I did when I was in my 20s. So there's something I think for each individual to explore what makes you slow in learning when it comes to thinking about what makes for a successful, progressive, modern organization or modern
Mm.
workplace.
Mm.
It
Such
might be the fear of failure, it might be
yeah.
conditioning, it might be, I think, falling into that trap of saying, well, that's what, I ran a public company, that's what public markets want, therefore their carnivores, give them red meat, versus, reframing that in such a way that, I'll give them red meat, but it'll be alongside some vegetables and some carbohydrates as well that enable them to have a fully balanced meal rather than just giving them what they think they need.
And obviously, Mike, you had that experience because you were the CEO of a publicly listed company. What advice might you have for other leaders in that situation, so that they can meet the board where they are, whilst at the same time broadening out their dinner plate so that there are also vegetables and carbohydrates on there?
Yeah, I think primarily as a leader, you need to deliver results.
Yeah.
You need to deliver the outcomes by whatever the measures are that are being used to measure your performance.
Yeah.
I think often human workplaces, rather than it being an outcome in itself, we can consider it to be more of an ingredient, like how do we deliver the results that we're looking for.
Mm.
Coming back to my own experience, I think working more diligently on creating a human workplace enabled us to deliver tangible business outcomes like profit, cash flow, return on capital, etc., rather than holding them as being separate. Like I've got my financial delivery and I've got all this cool people stuff that I'm doing in a separate work stream. I think they all go towards
Mm.
the scoreboard. And I certainly know that inside a company like Z, we had a balanced scorecard so that we were measuring core operational stuff like health and safety, customer metrics, people, internal employee-based metrics, and clearly the financial results,
Yeah.
both tactically and strategically as well. I think one thing that a lot of companies perhaps could do better is have a better balance between the measures they have to determine short-term success, as well as the ways in which they measure strategy execution or the strategic health of the company over time. And I personally fell out of love with the old phrase that if you take care of the next quarter, the next 10 years takes care of itself. That was maybe possible to do in the 70s and 80s where things were a lot more straightforward. I don't think that's possible today.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Mike. So that brings me on to the final question for our conversation today, which is, what are some of the practical things that you did at Z Energy or that you help your clients do today to really enable the conditions for humans to really thrive?
Yeah, I think one focus or area of focus would be personal development. I know that when I first turned up in Z, I put something on the screen in front of everybody that described the 6 elements of a world-class company.
Mm.
And one of those was workers more closely experienced as personal development rather than just work.
Mm.
Now, in those days, I didn't have a label called human workplaces to hang that underneath.
Mm.
That's one of the things that I said is an ingredient. It's one of the things that I committed to. So I think when you do invest in people's development, they feel valued. You get greater benefits from their increased capability. They're able to take those capabilities and share them back in their whānau or in their communities, etc., etc. So that would be one thing that I would tease out. And then the second thing would be taking a systems approach to what you actually do. So when I think about something like gender equality, or that gender within your overall commitment around diversity and inclusion. So I know that in Z, over a number of years, we built layer upon layer in terms of trying to make sure we were being truly system thinking around it. So for example, we did a bunch of the easy and obvious around balancing off what was a gender imbalance, making sure we promoted people rightly, we put more time and effort into encouraging women to give them confidence, blah, blah, blah. I shouldn't say blah, 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 but all the easy and obvious stuff.
Yeah.
And then we started to understand, well, what is it about when women, as many do, take a career break to be this, the primary caregiver? What does that mean? And we did things like we would provide a $10,000 bonus for women to come back to work, because there's usually a bunch of one-off costs that happen when women are at work. So we sort of got the gender thing working better in terms of balance. We then started to deal with what holds women back once we've got that balance right. Then we started to discover things like, at the end of their working career, women are financially disadvantaged relative to men. Why is that? It's kind of obvious, but then we did things like, while women are on parental leave, we still gave them an annual salary review. When women came back to work part-time, we paid them 100% of what would normally be their KiwiSaver contribution, rather than the 60, 75 or 80%, 90% that represented their part-time work. And I could go on, but I think it's that notion of layering things on top of one another and thinking about the whole system. It was frankly pointless to have an environment within which women could come to work and do their very, very best until a certain stage of their career, and then the inequities or the imbalances of the past came back to haunt them in a different way. So that was one thing I'd encourage people to do as well. If you get after some of this human workplaces stuff, is to take that system level thinking to it, rather than doing what I would call whack-a-mole, which is, we don't have enough women in management, whack, now we do. We don't have enough women returning to work, whack, now we do. Now, you don't have to do it all at once, and Z certainly didn't do it all at once, and Z, to the best of my knowledge, continues to find ways to evolve its diversity, equity, and inclusion work. But I think that system thinking is a really, really important part of it as well. So invest in people, and when you do anything to create a more meaningful human workplace, think about it from a systems perspective.
Thank you, Mike. As I listen to you, I'm sitting here with a slightly wry smile on my face, because as you'll recollect from human work, there were 5 mindsets that we found really seemed to be quite consistent across the leaders that we spoke to around the world, around the kind of mindsets they were holding to humanize their workplace. And of course, the first one was learning and growth, and creating the conditions for everybody to be able to continue to develop personally, professionally. And then the 5th one was human systems, taking a much more complexity-friendly view of the kind of directions that you're trying to move in, rather than, as you say, the whack-a-mole. And so it's probably not that surprising that there are a couple of examples that you use, but what I really appreciate about them, Mike, is they're not only mindsets, they're ways of being that enable you to take action that are really actually very practical and tangible on the ground, that make a difference for the human beings who work there.
Yeah, very much so. I work to quite a simple model around organization or cultural change, which is believe, behave, become. So what are our beliefs? Our behaviors are aligned with that, and that enables us to become something. And I do have a bit of a circular process around, I sort of follow that believe, behave, become, and then I say, well, is that enough for me to really become what I want us to be? And then you go back and say, where do we need to challenge or change or moderate our beliefs in some way, that we then have the behaviors that enable us to become. So that I found that a really useful model around organizational change or development, because so often we tend to go to the right-hand side of it and say we want to become this, but we don't fundamentally challenge what are our beliefs about human workplaces or gender equality, or any of the things that kind of enrich a human workplace, but we still get stuck with our own self-limiting beliefs.
Mike, I feel like we could talk for hours, but I'm committed to these videos being short, snappy pieces that people can kind of watch on their lunch break. I would really encourage any of you watching to reach out to Mike if you want to hear more of his wisdom, but particularly get a copy of Being Extraordinary. I don't mean this to be a big kind of plug thing about Mike's book, but like for me personally, to read the story of a highly successful CEO in a very traditional kind of world, in a publicly listed company, and read about that from a very practical but also visionary way, Mike. I hear what you stand for. And I thank you for everything that you do in the way in which you use your influence to make this world more extraordinary and more human.
Kia ora, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.